Give me 1 minute. Okay, here you go. Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our very first webinar by Amy Cameron from Pathways Treatment Center. We are all excited to get Amy on the webinar. She is a certified RDI consultant. She's a speech pathologist, and she has her career started as a speech pathologist up in the public school system, and then eventually she got interested into RDI, and she has attended many conferences. The good thing about Carrie is she's not only knows about RDI, but she is also studying the Masgotova neurosensory motor reflex integration work. And she started Pathways Treatment Center in 2004, and her vision is of a place of caring, respect, and real solutions for families affected by autism. So I am very new to RDI, and I think this is a great opportunity to learn about RDI. So Amy, I think you are the best person to talk about.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you, Manisha, and thanks guys for coming. We're going to record this webinar, and it's my very first webinar, so bear with me if there's technical difficulties. I have a PowerPoint, and I believe that I'm sharing my screen, but if you can't see it, raise your hand and we'll figure it out, okay? It's mighty weird sitting here just talking to my computer, but I know that you're there live, so I feel very supported. Thank you. All right, I'm going to go to the PowerPoint, I think. All right, so as Manisha said, I'm a speech and language pathologist. I live near Raleigh, North Carolina, and I have 22 years of experience with people who are impacted by autism. You know, when I first started as a speech therapist, I was doing a little bit of private practice in speech pathology, and I was invited by a neighbor to work with her son who had autism. And I remember that very first time that I got on my big old computer back in like 1989, and I looked up autism because it was very uncommon back then. At that point, the statistics were telling us 1 in 2,500 people were diagnosed with autism, and clearly over the past 20-some years, the autism numbers have raised greatly. I would say this, when I very first met the first child with autism, I was absolutely dumbfounded by the fact that this child was clearly very, very intelligent and was presenting in a way that I really felt kind of incompetent in addressing. I think that's one of the things about autism, that you're so used to interacting with people in a way that you're getting some reciprocity and some back and forth going, and with people of autism it's a lot more difficult to do that. But I also felt so intrigued and so interested in working with this particular population that I pursued a lot of different trainings about how do we address autism. And I landed on RDI, and I haven't looked back because I think it's a very effective treatment for autism. And I just wanted to go ahead and share some of my experience with that today and try to explain what RDI is in a comprehensive way for you guys. So I'll say this, when I started in the field of speech pathology, I guess there, can you see my signal there? I learned about speech and language disorders. And so when I was assigned children who had autism, I would approach from speech and language therapy. And I felt pretty good about my work as a speech pathologist. I felt like I was pretty effective at getting kids talking. But still, I wasn't really achieving what I hoped to achieve, or what the parents were describing to me as, true intervention for the child's autism. And what I've heard since that time, in working with many hundreds of parents, is that, you know, your child receives a diagnosis, and, you know, at that point you're kind of thrown to the wind. Go find out what you want to do about it. And so, in my experience, most people will go get a little speech therapy and maybe some occupational therapy, look into medications, look into gut and nutrition things, put their child in special education, and maybe even do some social skills training. And I think all of those are good things. And this was a very traditional model of how we would address autism from a therapeutic standpoint. So all of us were kind of chipping away at the autism from the area of expertise that we had. And I think what, at least for sure, what I was finding was a lot of frustration in that, you know, this helped a little bit, and this helped a little bit, and this helped a little bit. But it felt like nothing was actually really addressing what was happening here with the autism. And so one of the first things that I learned from an RDI perspective is that instead of approaching from each of these areas to address the autism, that we can address the autism itself, and we may not even need these other areas. We might, but we might not. And to me, that was quite fascinating, because I had tried and tried and tried as a speech therapist, and I was not getting anywhere in terms of addressing what the parents wanted me to address and what I had hoped to achieve with my clients who had autism. So Dr. Gutstein was the first one to say out loud to me, address this first, and then see what you need in these other realms, which was a pretty exciting thought for me. But I'm going to say this, if you're going to address autism, that means you have to have a consensus about what autism is. And shockingly, I found out that there's not a ton of consensus about what autism is. So when I ask parents who contact me, what is autism? They usually describe their child in pretty general terms in the symptomology of their one particular child. But that can be quite different than the last set of parents that I heard, or a guy that I know. And so this idea of what is autism became a very large question to me, and why people in the field were not agreeing about what is autism. And that is a really curious fact when you think about, you know, all of the money and time that's going into addressing autism. If there's not consensus about what it is, it's really difficult to know what you're even trying to address. If you don't have the goal in mind, then how do you know what you're addressing? So here's what we know for sure from a lot of research, and there's been tons of research and tons of development in this area since I started in the field. We know this, that autism is a developmental disorder of the brain. And I think that sounds really scary to parents. I know that as a parent myself, if you start talking about my child's brain, I start to freak out. But I'm going to say this, so much of the research in the past 20 years has talked about the brain as a plastic organ, as an organ that grows and develops and rewires and continues to rewire itself anatomically and physiologically through interaction and relationship with others. And so to me, that's a really hopeful thing, because your brain is an organ that changes within relationships, within experiences, whereas other organs of your body don't necessarily do that. So for instance, if you're a type 1 diabetic, you're not going to be able to just change your pancreas. But if you have a disorder of brain development, we know for sure that the brain can be rewired. There can be neurological redo with the brain. So for example, when I was in graduate school, I did an internship at the Kennedy Krieger Institute, which is part of Johns Hopkins Hospital. And the very first client that I had actually had an entire hemisphere of his brain removed because this child had a terrible seizure disorder, and without removal of that part of the brain, he would have died. And this really impacted me in watching this child, because in 6 weeks I watched this child learn to talk again, and to walk again, and to read, and to do so many of the things that you would think a person with half a brain would be unable to do. This had very, very big impact on me as a therapist, understanding that brains can rewire themselves. So, autism is a disorder of brain development, but in that there's much hope, because the brain is an experience-dependent organ. So when you look up autism on the internet, if you Google what is autism, you'll find a lot of descriptions about common symptoms that people have if they are diagnosed with autism, like things that include social difficulties, repetitive actions, difficulty with reciprocal and social language. And these are symptoms that are common amongst many people with autism. As of now, I don't believe that there are causes that are known. There's a lot of research in that area, but in the 22 years that I've been involved, we haven't seen a lot of progress in determining what the actual cause of autism is. And even scarier than that, we've seen an increase in the amount of cases of autism and no known specific cure for it. In the state of North Carolina, where I live, autism is currently impacting 1 out of every 44 boys in the state of North Carolina. So we've gone from 1 in 2,500 20 years ago to 1 in 44, and that's significant, because 2% of our population is now receiving diagnosis of autism. So, I don't know if this is in your way, you guys. It might be. Sorry about that. So when you're talking about autism, you can look at the symptomology, or you can go a little bit broader and you can take a look at what is known in the field as core deficit. Whoops. Does somebody have a question?
No.
No. I don't know. All right. So, so you can take a look at, in a broader sense, what a core deficit in any diagnosis would be. So, for example, I have type 1 diabetes, and my core deficit is that my body does not produce insulin. That's clear. In the case of autism, understanding what the core deficit is, again, isn't necessarily out there. People aren't really thinking about what that Asperger child has to do with that child who is much more impacted, and the fact that it is a spectrum disorder really makes it difficult to come up with core deficit. To cloud the waters even more, there's something known as co-occurring or coexisting conditions, meaning that if you have one disorder, you are more vulnerable to having more than one disorder. So, for example, I have type 1 diabetes, and I also have a thyroid condition. These things often go together, but not necessarily has all of the same coexisting conditions. This makes it really, really confusing, because some parents will come to me and say, well, my child is nonverbal and he has autism. What is the core deficit? What is it that we want to address first? Do we want to address that speech, the core deficits involving autism? So the decisions that you make about therapy be confusing, because oftentimes the coexisting conditions are more important than the actual autism itself. And these are decisions that have to be made individually by families, and hopefully with some professional input as to what can be addressed first. in the case of autism, when we're talking about deficit, it gets really confusing because I don't know, lining up cars considered a core deficit and broader in terms of how we determine what all people with the diagnosis of autism are dealing with. So if we took that even broader, you can look at the core deficit from because I'm not an engineer and I don't do science. So thinking about static versus dynamic at first kind of, I don't know, made me uncomfortable. But I'm going to say just, take a deep breath if this is you and consider what indeed are static processes when you're talking about the development of the brain and the mind. So static processes are things that include patterns, they're things that are learned rote, they're things that are predictable, there are things that have rules. And the thinking that goes along with those things, this comes first and then this happens and then this happens, or 2 plus 2 is always going to equal 4. The sun is always going to come up in the east and go down in the west. That type of thinking is what we call static thinking. It has to do with the acquisition of facts. It has to do with things that can be directly taught to somebody and things that are directly measurable. So, for example, when we're talking about communication, we can talk about static communication, like answering specific questions. That has to do with yes or no, black and white, not gray area thinking. But when we're talking about conversation, which goes back and forth, that's not really static in nature because you don't know what I'm going to say necessarily, and I don't know what you're going to say necessarily. And so that now becomes what we call static or dynamic processing. So dynamic processing are things that include gray area thinking, flexibility, handling emotions and dealing with multiple things at the same time, being able to cope with incompleteness, being able to deal with surprises or things that are relative in nature, being able to take somebody else's perspective. And we know for sure that dynamic processing requires many parts of the brain to light up together and to work together in order to come up with an area of processing that is comfortable. So when you're talking about static processing, we know for sure it's a yes or no, and I can check it off in the box. But when we're talking about dynamic processes, we can't really check it off. So learning a certain amount of words is a static process, but using those words within context with different people at an appropriate time with appropriate inflection and rate and prosodic feature is a whole different story. It's much more difficult to measure that. And how do people do it? We don't typically have to teach people these dynamic processes. In neurotypical development, kids are just developing these things sort of magically, it seems like. And so they're never taught. But in the case of autism, these things are not developing in the way that we would expect. So I would venture to say, and this is what Dr. Goodstein taught me, is that people who have a diagnosis of autism are stronger with things that are static in nature, static thinking, static communication, static functioning, and they have a relative weakness in the area of dynamic processing, flexible thinking, dealing with surprises and changes, transitions, gray area thinking, incompleteness, taking somebody else's perspective. So when you start to take a look at what areas your child with autism is having difficulty with, it's likely that you can boil that down to something which is dynamic in nature. That's not to say that people with autism are always super strong in the area of static processing. So having autism doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have, say, a learning disorder. It doesn't mean that, learning a specific amount of words is really easy for you. But usually, relatively, this is the diagnosis criteria, is that there's a differentiation between what this child can do statically and what this child can do dynamically. If you were talking about if you were talking about intellectual delay, you may be talking about a more global delay in both static and dynamic processing. If you were talking about a specific learning disability, you're probably talking about static process disorder being more difficult than a dynamic process. But in the case of autism, we're talking about static versus dynamic. Does anybody have questions about that? Are you guys following me? I feel like I'm alone in a room talking. Raise your hand if you have any questions.
We're hearing you.
Okay, great. So, what is relationship development intervention? RDI is specifically, wow, I am really not good with my PowerPoint. Excuse me for that. Relationship development intervention specifically is a dynamic intelligence curriculum. RDI is a curriculum that was developed by Dr. Stephen Gutstein and his wife, Dr. Rachel Sheely. And what they did is they took a look at those areas of dynamic processing, and they looked into how do those areas develop. This was news to me because when I was taking child development courses, we were talking about things that, again, we could directly see and directly measure, like what age does the child roll over, when do they eat solid foods. But what Gutstein and his wife were looking at is a little different than that. They were taking a look at how do these dynamic processes develop, and in what order do they develop. And they pulled upon some really important work from people like Barbara Rogoff and Dr. Tomasello, and many developmentalists have taken a look at how does dynamic intelligence develop. And so they built their curriculum based on that sequence of development. So RDI teaches dynamic intelligence through the natural process of guidance. When we see how static intelligence is acquired, it's acquired through directed teaching. Right now, I'm directly teaching you what RDI is. And if I gave you a quiz at the end, which, yes, it's this, it's that, you could use multiple answers and you guys would be able to answer those questions, hopefully at the end of this talk. But when you're talking about dynamic intelligence, it's not directly measurable. And I think it's an important point to make when people ask me a lot about where's the research behind RDI. And I would say this, that the research is in development, but it's not quite as straightforward as it would be if we were measuring something that was black and white in nature. When you're talking about peer-reviewed studies, they want to review things that are directly measurable, that have statistics to them, and are not taking into account the fact that context changes and that people are very dynamic beings, and that it's very difficult to control every single thing around human beings. That's not to say that things aren't developing in that area of research, but it is a lot harder to get research studies on areas that are not directly measurable. Now, how does dynamic intelligence develop? That's the question, because if we're looking at, okay, these are some of the processes that come into place first, we have to take a look at how are those processes taught, how are they acquired, because we want to replicate that. I talked about a few minutes ago the fact that the brain can be rewired, that re-exposure to something that may have been missed in the chaos of development can begin to create neural pathways and change the anatomy and physiology of that cortex. So knowing that, we want to take a look at, naturally in the world, how are babies developing dynamic intelligence. And we know from a lot of research that it's through a process that that has been called guided participation. And guided participation is essentially how parents guide their child throughout the very dynamic world and give them their pattern of thinking. How I view the world is how my mother viewed the world. It's not directly taught, but it was acquired by me during that process of growing. And so in RDI, what we do is we take a look at that guided participation relationship. And inevitably, in the case of autism, there's a breakdown in the guided participation relationship. Not necessarily because the parents don't want to guide. In fact, most of the parents I know of children who have autism are absolutely extraordinary guides to their child's development. But because of this thing called autism, there is a lot of difficulty in guiding that child. It's very difficult to teach somebody who's not paying attention to you or who is unable to pay attention to you. And so the process of guided participation is how we acquire dynamic intelligence. But if we don't have that process naturally in place, that's where we begin. We take a look at how can we help this child to become an apprentice in his parents' thinking? How can he learn to learn through his mother and father? We pick the parents because, well, we didn't pick parents. You know, parents are parents of children, and so you were given this child, and you should be the guide to this child's development. Having a diagnosis of autism does not negate that. In fact, it increases the importance of that, even though I think the message given to many parents is that your child has this diagnosis, go let the experts deal with it. Let the experts who know what they're doing teach your child. I don't agree with that at all. I feel that parents for sure are the best and most natural and most motivated guides to their child's development. I think it is your right and your blessing and your, you know, your duty as a parent to get to guide your child's development. It should be your honor to do that. It's easy to do in the case of autism, and the process of RDI, the therapy of RDI, is how do we find a way to reestablish that, not just for the child, but for the parent, because this relationship is going to be what matters throughout a lifespan. People often ask me, if I have another child, can that child participate in an RDI program? And I would say absolutely, absolutely yes. We work with parents who have real lives and real other children, and I think RDI actually works for an entire family unit together in a really nice way. So the parents would work with an RDI consultant to learn how to guide dynamic development. And I think that people are like, well, why would we need a consultant to teach us about dynamic development? And I'm going to say that it's complicated. It's a complicated process. And in the case of RDI, the consultants are highly trained and are really good at delineating which goals and objectives we need for that particular child and that particular family, and what strategies are going to work the best. So in RDI, the consultant works directly with the parent. We brainstorm, we educate each other. You educate me about your child, and I educate you about dynamic intelligence processes, strategies, and objectives. And then together we work to help this child to begin the process of developing dynamic intelligence together. So it is a co-regulatory process between parents and the consultant, and we work together to problem solve, and we go at it in a very specific way for each individual. RDI is quite cost-effective because parents are receiving the education. I know for sure parents, and then with that knowledge, the parents are the ones applying RDI pervasively with their child. And so, you know, people get nervous about that. They're like, well, am I supposed about stuff like that? And I would say this, there are times the ready to be with child and you're filming those interactions. And you have to film an RDI because your consultant doesn't live with you. And you need to be able to analyze and make decisions based on how opportunities are being offered to the child and how the child is responding to what the parents are offering in order to know how to proceed. So in RDI, parents apply work pervasively. They don't videotape their whole life, but they do tape weekly. You know, different consultants have different amounts of taping that they require from their parents. Typically, I like to have, you know, between 10 and 20 minutes of taped interaction with the parents. It's a lot easier now than it used to be because you can upload or you can send me a file with your videotape on there. And then together we go through that process together. And we take a look at what's happening and your thought process. And together we develop where we're going to go next. So in the case of RDI, your consultant becomes somebody that you work with and you work through together. Okay. So let's get a little bit more specific and talk about the kinds of things that RDI addresses. Like, what kinds of things would you be working on with your child in an RDI program? That's a great question. In an RDI program, we know that it's a developmental program, and it looks first at the important underlying processes that are needed for dynamic thinking, communicating, and functioning. So we're taking a look at the processes that develop from a very early age on. We're looking at processes that develop starting about 3 to 6 months of age, and we are going back and re-exposing that child to those processes. And some of those processes would be things like joint attention, experience sharing, regulation of body, regulation of mind, regulation of emotions, social referencing, co-regulation, collaboration, dynamic decision-making. There's many, many areas that we develop. So the first part of RDI is called the Family Consultation Program. And in the Family Consultation Program, the first part of that is spent with the parent, teaching that parent how you will re-expose your child's experience-dependent organ to specific mental processes. And that sounds really straightforward, but in truth it's not. It has to do with how you're communicating, it has to do with your environment, it has to do with how you're thinking about doing things with your child, and it has to do with how your family functions as a group. And so that's a pretty specific process. And for the most part, my parents are not developmental therapists, so we need to work on that together. Once my parents are to a stage where they're very comfortable with guiding their child, then we start to implement very specific mental processes. For example, maybe it's experience sharing. How do I know that my child and I are experiencing things together in the same way? We work on experience sharing. We work on first that joint attention. Is the child able to pay attention to the same thing as you? If not, then we work on regulation first. And most of the time, we work on regulation first, no matter what. So with some people who are impacted by autism, it looks like more brainstem issues are present, like focus and attention, sensory processing. Those types of things are handled by the brainstem, and we may need to do work with integration of brainstem in order for that child to be able to function and learn more and be guided. Other kids are more sensory calm, they're able to pay attention, but maybe they're hyperverbal, and we have to work on the communication issues that are surrounding. So it really is a very customizable program depending on where this child and where this parent are functioning together, where that relationship starts. And so in order to determine that, I'm going to skip that slide for a second. We do something called the Relationship Development Assessment. And I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about what that assessment includes, because it's not your regular assessment. The RDA is not something that you do without a diagnosis. The RDA is done after you have diagnosis, and it's really an information finding tool. So what we do is we take a baseline filming of the child and the parents within specific activities together, and they're not really earth-shattering activities. They're things like playing drums together or playing with a ball together. But what we do is we take a baseline film and we give the parent and the child very specific things that they can do together, and not much direction beyond that. So in that assessment, we can take a look at where is that child developmentally in terms of the processes that are dynamic in nature. What are we seeing from that child? Is that child able to pay attention to the same thing as the parent? Is that child able to reference the parent and gather information from the parent? Is that child experience sharing with the parent? Are they remembering things in a different way than the parent? How's their emotional regulation? We're taking a look at very dynamic processes that are occurring with the child. And at the same time, we're taking a look at the parent's guiding style. How does this parent react to a child who doesn't necessarily respond in a way that is expected? What is that parent's communication like? What kinds of things do they do to help their child? What kinds of resilience do they have in the face of interaction failure? We're looking at a lot of different things with how the parent is guiding the child. And so these films are made, and then they're analyzed quite carefully by your RDI consultant, who's going through and looking for the strengths and the obstacles within this relationship, within the parent's guiding style and within the child's development, within what we see happening with these two people together. So we typically will film the parent, the mother and the child, and the father and the child alone. So every relationship is slightly different. I've had times where I know that I have grandparents who are highly involved, maybe living in the home. I'll also film with that person, because if they have a lot of influence over the child, certainly I would like to take a look at what that relationship looks like. So the RDA is really about information gathering so that you can customize that program, so that your consultant can customize that program to be the best fit for that family. Because what one family has going on is for sure not the same thing that another family has going on. And that assessment is then repeated every 6 months to a year so that we have comparison point. So in the RDA, we don't have things that we're checking off, because again, we're looking at dynamic development, and you can't check these things off in a box. But if we do comparison films, we're able to take a look at, this is where it was 6 months ago, and this is where we're at now. What looks different? And we can see if we're beginning to impact what we're targeting in an RDI program. I hope that makes sense. I wish you guys could talk to me. I'm going to have a question and answer session in just a minute. Okay. So I want to talk for a minute about why it's important to utilize the developmental program, at least in my opinion, when you're addressing something that has to do with the brain, why you would want to follow a developmental program versus a program that simply takes a look at symptoms and begins to wipe out those symptoms. We know this about brains. We know for sure that if you're talking about a disorder of the brain, you want to take a look at the fact that the brain is an experience-dependent organ. I mean, this concept obviously is important to me because it really changed how I thought about what I was doing as a therapist. So I take a look at what that experience-dependent organ is actually experiencing. And we know this, if what that brain is experiencing is very, very different from the norm, the development of those neural pathways, the anatomy and physiology of that brain will be different. So if you have a very large sensory processing disorder and information is coming into your body in a different way, that is going to impact your brain development because your experience is going to be different than it would be otherwise. If I experience anxiety around the fact that my dynamic processing is not so good, my reactions to things that are the same but different may be very different than the norm. So I'm just saying that it's really important that we take a look at the processes that normally happen and re-expose the brain to as much as we can of how normal development occurs. Because we know that throughout all millennia and all over the planet, that human brains develop in certain order, that there are certain processes that are fundamental before other processes occur. And when those steps are skipped, the long-term fallout will occur. So, for example, we know from the field of child development that if a child does not crawl, that it's likely that child will have learning disability later down the road. So we follow developmental programming and we expose that brain to the prerequisites it needs in order to develop a more solid basis. But in the case of autism, sometimes what we see are skipped stages of development. For example, some of the kids I know with autism learn how to read at a very early age. They can read without being instructed to read. But unfortunately, their comprehension of what they're reading is not usually so strong because they're not learning in the same way as they should be learning for neurotypical development. So the idea behind RDI, and actually the idea behind MNRI, is to take a look at what are those developmental prerequisites for the brain, and how do we re-expose the brain to those prerequisites, those mental processes, so that the brain can develop as normally and as optimally as possible. Okay. Why would you work with an RDI consultant? You know, this is commentary that I sometimes see on the internet. I don't know. The field of autism is really sometimes a very competitive field, and I think that the real reasoning behind that is that autism makes people feel incompetent. It's not what you expect. You're used to being able to tell a kid to do something and they just do it. You're used to a child having this natural desire and motivation to want to be around you, and when they're not, it's really kind of unexpected and can be very disconcerting and make the strongest of adults feel incompetent. When you're talking about development of something that normally occurs and it's not occurring, but people don't usually talk about it, you need somebody who's an expert in that field. You need somebody who knows what they're taking a look at to guide you so that you can guide your child. So the development of dynamic processes usually occur without direct targeting, but also that means you're not usually aware of what those processes are, nor are you aware of the hierarchy that takes place in. And really that's what RDI consultants are very good at. That's what we're trained to do, is to take a look at dynamic mental processes as they typically occur. And we know that development pretty well. And that's why you would need a consultant, because that person will customize that plan based on what they're seeing with your child. It's also why your consultant needs you, because the consultant is never, ever, ever going to know your child in the way that you do. Never going to be able to understand the context that this child is coming up in, the communication that this child is using. And so it's a very collaborative process between the parent and the consultant. Consultants are also quite good at problem solving, supporting, and recognizing when and how to target specific goals and objectives that are about those dynamic processes. That's why you would need a consultant. I'm asking myself questions now. We talked about the assessments. I'm going to open it up to questions from you guys, because I think that that you may have some questions, and that may help us to be a little clearer. Does anybody out there have any questions? Hi, Sarah. Hey, Sarah, I'm going to unmute you. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
I don't know how to unmute her, Manisha.
Yeah.
There you are. Okay. Sarah is a parent of a family that I work with. Can you talk, Sarah?
Yeah.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Sarah, can you? Yeah, I can hear you. Can you talk to us just a little bit about what an RDI program, like why would you choose an RDI program? How did you end up coming into RDI?
Well, I heard about it from someone who had a lot of success with it, so initially I just was coming to check it out. But what I ended up really liking about it was that you don't just take your kid to someone for 1 hour a week or 2 hours a week, and that's all you're really doing for your kid. You know, instead it's like you're learning and you are absorbing and finding out how you can help them, you know, 24/7 as much as your energy and focus, you know, allows. And it just felt really natural that it worked into things we were already doing anyway, and it just made a lot of sense.
That's awesome. Thanks, Sarah. Does anybody have any questions? I'm unmuting everybody so people can speak.
If you unmute everybody,
are you there?
there will be a lot of echo. If you
Kathy?
I am here.
Hey, Kathy. Kathy is also an RDI consultant as well as a parent.
Amy.
Kathy, what drew you into RDI?
Amy, if you
Yes.
unmute everybody, they all are going to hear a lot of echo.
Oh, okay. I'm just gonna mute everybody but Kathy. Hold on.
Yes.
Muted. All right, guys. I'm playing with my webinar. All right. Kathy, what drew you into RDI?
Well, what drew me into RDI was that I noticed that I was really trying to help my son with all those skills that we were targeting, but there was still a big gaping hole in, like you were talking about, the mental processes that he wasn't understanding. So we were kind of addressing the symptoms. And, you know, we did see some progress, but it really didn't take us to where we wanted to go. And when I learned about RDI, that was the program that was going to take us where we needed to go with that deeper, you know, dynamic thinking.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Yeah, Kathy's a great consultant in New Jersey. If anybody's
New
from
Jersey.
Yeah, go with New Jersey. Get your hairspray on, Kath. Thanks, Kath.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions? I guess you have to raise your hand because I have to mute everybody. Raise your hand if you have a question. There's no questions. Crazy.
There is one question
Okay.
by Laura.
Are you there?
By Laura.
Oh, wait, who is it? Unmute.
Okay. There is one question by Laura.
Okay.
Can RDI be used with a child who does not have a diagnosis of autism, but one with intellectual disability?
Absolutely. Absolutely. RDI was originally designed with children who have autism in mind, but certainly it is an excellent program to help with the development of dynamic thinking, period. So if you think about when I was talking about static versus dynamic processing, if you want to have a child who's doing better with dynamic processing, certainly you can apply that. You certainly can apply those same procedures and processes to that child. Absolutely. And you know, many children who have autism also have some intellectual delay along with that. And so certainly I would address from both directions, from static and dynamic processing. You know, I think one of the things that is so confusing in my years with people who have a child with autism is, you know, parents tell me the time that they receive a diagnosis and then they're sort of thrown in front of autism without really knowing what the heck to do. And so everybody runs and gets on their computer and begins Googling things, and there's so much information out there now that it's quite confusing. People are like, I don't even know what to do with my kid. What should I do? And you know, this kind of panic ensues, and people start to do a lot of therapies, and they become more like chauffeurs to their child. They become the ones who are taking their kid to therapy, taking their kids to school, taking their kids to these places, instead of actually being the one empowered to work with that child. And that really disturbs me when I see this process that occurs, at least in the United States, with parents becoming disempowered with their child who has autism, instead of, you know, getting the support, education, and goals and objectives that they need to help their child to develop properly. I think that process really needs to change, and I believe that RDI is the strongest out there at doing that, at empowering parents. Oh, Jamie has a question. I'm going to unmute you. Hi, Jamie.
Hi. Do you have any tips for questions that parents can ask a consultant to know that they're a good fit with that consultant?
Sure. I think that having a good fit with your consultant is absolutely key, because this is a person that is going to get to know you really well and get to know your family really, really well. And certainly, you know, consultants are people, and we all have different personalities. We all have different styles of how we work with families. And so, you know, it's usually a question of who's closest to you, and people feel like they have to work with the person who's closest to them. And it makes the most sense if you have a local RDI consultant, and you can find a list of those consultants on the RDI Connect website. If you have a local talking to them, I know a lot of us do a free short session with parents so that you can get to know them without having to pay for that session. Certainly, I offer a 2-hour free discussion for parents so that they can get to know me and get a feel for whether or not my fit is going to be good for you. And if not, you know, a lot of us know each other. Oftentimes I'll recommend somebody, you know, I happen to be kind of, I'm not really organized, I'll put it that way. And there are people who are far more organized, and if that's your style, then you know, certainly I would recommend somebody in that direction. But the important part about RDI is that you don't have to be local. I mean, certainly there are families that I've worked with, you know, from Raleigh, talking to them in Hanoi or in Singapore, in China. I work with families from all over the world, and the internet makes it really nice and easy to be able to do that. So kinds of questions I would ask them about their assessment requirements, if they're going to require you to fly in to do an assessment, or if they'll come to you to do an assessment, or how that's going to work. I would ask questions about how consultation is going to take place, if they have a specified package that they're requiring you to purchase. You know, different consultants offer their businesses in different ways. Certainly, you know, I can talk to you about my practice and how I do it, and, you know, you're going to hear a completely different story from somebody else. So, you know, and I also think you want to ask that person's background to see if that's in line. If your child has some co-occurring conditions, say, for instance, if your child has a speech and language disorder, my background as a speech pathologist may really help you out. Whereas other people are special educators who are RDI consultants. Other people are parents of children, and they have that sort of insight from that direction. So I would ask, you know, what brought them into RDI, and, you know, how, and get an idea of how that fits for your family too. Also, I would say different consultants offer different things. At my center, we do once a month parent meeting that is live, and the parents get to come together, get to know each other, and there's a pretty nice community going on there. We participate in things together, and different consultants offer different things in that way also. Did that answer your question, Jamie?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you.
Cool, sure.
Okay, there is a question from Laura.
Any other questions?
Yeah, question from Laura.
Okay.
From Laura, how old is too old to start with this? My daughter is 15. 15.
Oh, cool. I have a 15-year-old too. You're never too old as far as I'm concerned, because I think that there are a lot of myths out there about the idea of brain plasticity ending at particular ages. The oldest person I've worked with was a 45-year-old. I believe that your brain continues to learn and grow and develop throughout a lifespan. I happen to love working with teenagers. I think they're awesome. I think it's really, really fun, and I think it's really good for your relationship. So 15 is certainly not too old. Absolutely not.
Okay. Another question is, hi Amy and everyone.
The youngest we work with was 15.
Sorry.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead. No, sorry. Go ahead. Finish.
The youngest we've started with was 15 months, and he looks great. He's 5 now, and he looks really good.
Okay. So the next one is, hi Amy and everyone. This is Ha from Hanoi, an RDI parent for 4 years, and RDI CIT. I wanted to share with everyone that I am so excited with RDI since I've become the best guide for my child, for caregivers and teachers who can work with him every day. The learning process is so natural, and we the parents are no longer overwhelmed with creating teaching materials to teach our child. We can use RDI in almost every daily activities. Just wanted to share.
Yeah, Ha is wonderful. She's a wonderful mother, and she's done some amazing things with her child. She's bringing RDI to Hanoi and doing a great job of it. So I think Ha makes a really important point. People sometimes will ask, well, what kind of equipment do I need to do RDI? And in reality, you just need to have a life that you're doing things in, because the process of guided participation happens within real life. It's what you do every day, and you can turn those into targeted opportunities for your child to grow and develop through those activities. That's awesome. Thank you, Ha.
I have a question.
Are there any other questions?
I have a question, Amy.
Mm-hmm.
If you talked about regulation, you talked about joint attention, you talked about regulation, body, mind, emotion. What if there's a child, like in our son's case, definitely he's getting much regulated as we are working on the MNRI and the brainstem level. His relationship with us is very stronger, and he expresses all his thoughts by typing, and even the language is coming. Definitely joint attention is there, but the regulation issue is still a issue. So in that case, how RDI can be a fit for him, where there are some gaps. He's forming relationship in school with his aide. He has friends. He talks about them. He's very emotional. He expresses everything how he feels, and we just are doing from FC. We are transitioning him to RPM, and that is also working beautifully. The only biggest issue still is the regulation issue, which is still going to take time.
Yeah, and I would say that regulation takes place on many levels, Manisha. When you're talking about regulation from the brainstem level, you're talking about regulating the sensory system, the attention and focus system, and getting those brainstem functions occurring optimally. But I would also say from a cortical level, you have to take a look at mental regulation and keeping those things solid so that this child can regulate within relationship with that person. So, you know, we use a lot of mental patterning with kids to begin with, and then we begin very quickly to expand that into co-regulatory processes. And the child does not need to be verbal. The child certainly can use typing, and the child certainly would, there would be a large emphasis on the nonverbal communication pieces before we would be getting into higher level speaking processes. So really, even with the typing, we would probably be focusing a little bit below that level at nonverbal level with that child. Because if you think about development, babies aren't really born speaking. They don't come out talking, but they sure do come out communicating. You can usually tell when a baby is crying to have its needs met, when a baby is happy, and when a baby is trying to engage you. And all of that happens non-verbally for approximately 2 years. And so we would be taking a look at the processes that would be occurring within that time frame, and not necessarily targeting the language that comes on top of that developmentally after the age of 2. Does it make sense?
Yeah, so you mean to say even with the RDI, you can still work at the lower part of the brainstem level, even with that's precisely I'm understanding.
Well, not necessarily just at the brainstem level. I would say, you know, you would be working non-verbally in communication, which is more like limbic system to cortical system. You would be working higher up in the brain, but developmentally you wouldn't be targeting above, you wouldn't be targeting language until we have that piece of it under control. We would take a look at how that goes.
Okay. Okay, and that answered my question. Thank you, Amy.
Cool. Great. All right. If nobody else has any questions, I just want to say thanks for coming out and supporting me here on my first webinar. It wasn't totally smooth, but it went pretty well, I think. I appreciate you guys coming out, and I'm going to be doing one webinar a month. If there are topics you would love to hear, you know, a short lecture like this on online, because I like to do that. That's what I do at my parent meetings. So let me know if there's topics you'd love to hear more about, and please make sure you're on my mailing list so that you'll know when the next webinar takes place. Okay. Thank you guys for coming.
Amy, thank you so much.
Good night.
Amy, thank you so much. You really did a wonderful job, and I think it went really very smooth. It was really very good.
Awesome.
And I've learned a lot. So
Awesome.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Manisha.
Bye bye.
Now, well, are we going to have a link for this, or how does that work?
Yeah, I'm going to make the video, and I'm going to compile it, and I will put it on, where do you want me to put it? On YouTube or on Vimeo? Where do you want me to put it?
Go ahead and put it on YouTube.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so maybe, I don't know, I think I can do it maybe when I come to DC. Maybe I'll put it from there.
That's fine. Yeah, I'm not in a huge hurry about it. I just want to have a link to it so I can get it on my Facebook and get it out there on my website too.
Yes. That I will definitely try to give you as early as possible.
Cool.
Okay,
Thank
you
you so much.
Bye bye.
All right, I'll see you tomorrow, I bet.
Yes. Bye bye.
Yeah.